So you're driving in the Southwest, specifically southern Arizona, and you see these incredible tall cacti. They're an iconic cacti of this region called the Saguaro. And as you're driving, your child asks you, Daddy, why do those cacti have arms? And you think to yourself, excellent question, right? That's not a dumb question. There are no dumb questions in a biology class. Now, this isn't a biology class, but anyone who travels with me is essentially in a biology class. And I thought, that's an intriguing question. We should think about that. Let's ask ourselves, why do Saguaro cacti have arms? Let's explore that coming up. Now, in fact, this really happened. This question was really asked of me. And I had pondered this for a while, and this happened over spring break. I came back and I was in front of a classroom of college students. And I told them a little bit about my trip, and I developed a question for them. I asked this question and several other questions, which I'm going to show you in a few minutes. And I posed this question to my class as a thought exercise for them. So I had them get together in groups. I had a very large class of over 100 students. I broke them up into smaller groups. I gave them this question. They had to think through and come up with a reasonable hypothesis based on their knowledge of biology at why do Saguaro cacti have arms? What would be the advantage of that? How did they get arms? Why do they make those arms? What do you think? What kind of advantage might they have having arms? What disadvantages might there be to having arms? But before we get to ask that question, let me show you a few pictures to introduce you to Saguaro cacti and talk a little bit about their biology. Then I'm going to give you some more sort of factoids about Sahuaros because knowing these facts will help us develop a fairly robust hypothesis. And I'll explain how difficult it would be to test that hypothesis. But nonetheless, I think that I can convince you of what are probably the primary reasons why Saguaro cacti grow arms. So let's get after that. Here's a picture this is actually from Saguaro National Park. And this, which is near Tucson, Arizona. And you'll see here a magnificent Saguaro cacti right in the center here with these massive appendages, right? These massive arms. And in fact, most of the Sahuaros you see here have arms, but some of them don't. So I took this picture a little farther west of the national park, and this is in the Sonoran Desert, an incredible place, an amazing diversity of different cacti there. But the cactus we're focused on are these dramatic posts that look like they're just sticking up out of the ground here. But you'll notice something about these. These are all a single stem, all right, with no branches coming off. The branches we're going to call arms. And these are unbranched. And so the thing about these unbranched ones is that they're smaller. So that's a hint about cacti growing arms. They only grow arms at certain stages in their life. All right. So there's a developmental process that Saguaro cacti undergo. And these are all, you could infer from what I'm saying, that these are all young Sahuaros. Now, I'll save it for a few minutes to talk about what does young mean for a saguaro. That's another really fascinating thing about saguaro. Here I am standing next to an especially large Saguaro cactus, and it gives me a chance to tell you that its scientific name is Carnegie gigantea, and it's either called the saguaro, or I might slip and say saguaro at points in this talk. The other common name is giant cactus, for obvious reasons. It's a very large cactus. And there I am standing there for comparison. Now, these cacti are actually, maybe 18 to 20 feet tall, but they can get up to 40 feet tall. And what is behind me, I'm standing in Saguaro National Park. here, and I'm up on a ridge overlooking the valley floor in the Sonoran Desert, and the green in the background out there is mostly Saguaro cacti. It literally a forest of these cacti growing here. So they're extremely abundant in this part of the country. So southern Arizona and then down into Mexico. But overall, they have a very limited geographical distribution. Here's some more from another portion of the Sonoran Desert. This is maybe 10 miles north of the U.S.-Mexican border. And again, a lot of younger Sahuaros here. This is also in the Sonoran Desert, a few miles from that previous shot. And here we have a combination of, here's a nice Sahuaro with no arms. Here's one that has a few new buds, so it's just beginning to grow its arms. And then we have what I'll call a more mature Sahuaro that has a full set of arms. Well, actually, they can have up to some 50 arms, but some rather lengthy arms. And that particular Sahuaro, to give you an idea of the lifespan of these, that Sahuaro is probably 150 years old. It's a little hard to tell the ages of Sahuaros. There's a couple different potential dating mechanisms, but they are not very precise. And so unless you were there, right, to see that Saguaro in its first days and know when it was born, so to speak, it's a little bit difficult to tell how old they are, but probably it's certainly more than 100 years old, potentially more than 200 years old. So very, very long-lived cacti. Here we are. Here's several people from my family, and we are visiting Organ Pipes National Monument, which sits right on the U.S.-Mexican border. And Organ Pipes refers to there's actually another kind of cacti back there in the distance called Organ Pipes, which is somewhat related to Sahuaros. But there's lots of Sahuaros here as well. And here, once again, we have an older one with arms, and we have several that are just a single stem. And here we are back in Saguaro National Park. Love Joshua trees too. Interestingly, no Joshua trees here, but in the Mojave Desert, you have lots of Joshua trees. So there's something different about these two deserts, the Sonoran Desert versus the Mojave Desert. They have a different flora. And here you see some just really huge Saguaro trees. So with that introduction, we want to get to the primary question of this video. Why do Sahuaros have arms, right? Why do they have arms? So here's some other factoids before we get to those answering that question. The first arm typically begins to grow around 70 years of age. So this cactus is already 70 years old before it begins to grow this first appendage. They reach a reproductive age a little bit earlier. So anywhere between 36, 65 years is sort of the range for when they become reproductive. Remember, for a plant to become reproductive, that just means making flowers, right, which enables them to make seeds and therefore produce offspring. So they're waiting at least 35 years before they even attempt to make a flower. They even make an attempt to reproduce themselves. This is a particular strategy, which is a very interesting but also risky strategy on the part of a plant, that you would wait 35 years before you try to reproduce. A lot of things can happen to you, in 35 years. And if something happens to you such that you never reach reproductive age, then you're never going to actually have any offspring, right? And so from a natural selection point of view, there is a high risk in terms of delaying reproductive age. But as we'll see, there's also certain types of rewards to delaying reproductive age as well. So while they're still just a single stem, they can begin to be reproductive, and then they start growing arms at a later point. When they start producing flowers, they produce a lot of them. They may produce over 200 flowers near the top of each stem. Or in this case, each arm. And each fruit from each flower might have 2,000 very, very tiny seeds inside. They produce a fleshy fruit. That fleshy fruit then can be eaten by birds, which then digest, or they eat the flesh of the fruit, but the seeds are embedded in that. That would go into their stomachs, and then they digest away the soft parts, all right, the fruity parts. And then when the bird flies away, the hope is that it's going to sit somewhere else and do its business, in which case they're going to they're going to defecate somewhere. And in that little pile of defecated material, there's going to be a whole bunch of seeds sitting in a nice pile of fertilizer. And that will hopefully give the next saguaro cactus some kind of starting point. But if you do some quick calculations for yourself, 2,000 fruits times 200 flowers, we're talking about an awful lot of seeds produced by a single saguaro. All right, as I mentioned before, some of these saguaro can be 150 years or more. It's thought that many of them may be over 200 years old. So long-lived plants. So we have a couple questions, and these are actually the questions I posed to my class, that I had them get together, and I gave them a sheet of paper, and I said, now you have to write out some hypothesis for some answer based on your biological knowledge to this point in your careers. What would be possible reasons why, or what would be the incentive for sahuaros to grow arms? Why do you imagine that they might grow an arm? Right? One of the questions, if you're a biologist, you should be curious about the world and asking questions about why do we see what we see? Right? There's 100 questions in a single sahuaro. Why do they live so long when other organisms around them might not live nearly as long? So that's my second question. Why do sahuaros live so long? Right? Why do we observe that they have long lifespans? And what environmental factors would allow sahuaros to evolve such a late reproductive age? In my class, we've discussed life history traits, that is, patterns that organisms go through in terms of their history, right? The history of their life. And some organisms are annuals, and there are annuals in this desert. An annual would be a plant that you might typically consider annuals. Many of them are weeds, if you want to think about common weeds you know of, that grow up very, very quickly, and then they produce seeds, and then the whole plant dies, right? And so in the space of 1 year, they go through a whole generation, and the next generation is then reliant on the seeds going forward. The complete opposite pattern, all right, life history trait would be put a lot of energy into producing an adult plant that has a structure that can survive for a long period of time. So think, large oak tree. And an oak puts an enormous amount of energy into growing a stem, right, to hold itself up and to have large branches, and then to be able to have a lot of surface area in order to gather in a lot of light, which is a lot of energy, and then store a lot of energy for future years, right? And eventually then start forming acorns, which then give you the capacity to have offspring. But they may not start having offspring for the first 10 years of their life, right? They're going to wait 10 or 15 years before they actually start to produce those acorns. Well, now, the example I'm showing you here is even more extreme. We're talking about 36 years, but maybe waiting until you're 70 years old. This plant is waiting around for 70 years, developing the vegetative part of the plant, the not reproductive part of the plant, for 70 years prior to then engaging in any form of reproduction. So that is the extreme end, right, of the life history traits compared to your annual plants. All right. So what are the different environmental factors that encourage one pattern of life history versus another pattern of life history? So I wanted them to try to identify what are some of the characteristics what are some of the things in the environment that would have to exist for that particular strategy to pay off, right? And it's such an extreme strategy that what they've probably learned in both my class and other classes are sort of like typical examples. And I'm throwing a more extreme example in them to make them think about extreme biology, right? The extreme ends to which organisms will go. And usually there's some particular environmental situation that then creates the conditions that allow for these extreme states. All right, so there's our questions. Mostly we're interested in why saguaros grow arms. That was my primary question. But we'll kind of dabble in trying to answer all of these questions. And I'm just going to do that with a couple slides and just going to talk about this. All right, so here's our example of no arms. Here we have a lot of arms and my daughter for scale. And over here, I'm just showing you that the flowers are produced at the tips of the branches. So I think I've probably given you a pretty strong hint for one reason why cacti might grow arms, right? It's pretty obvious that if you grow an arm, you have more area in order to produce flowers. And if you produce more flowers, you can produce more fruit. And if you produce more fruit, you have a greater chance of having offspring, right? And if there's one force at play, right, in organisms over the history of life, all right, it's being able to reproduce. Success at reproduction constitutes passing your particular genes forward to the next generation, right? And so if you have successful genetics in terms of making an organism that can survive to reproductive age and manage to have offspring, then your offspring are probably going to have similar traits to, right, the parent of those offspring. And if the parent has certain traits like growing arms, then they're probably going to grow arms. So one question we could ask ourselves, and this is, so in my assignment, I just asked them to talk about, what are different things, what are different variables that you would want to know or that you would speculate exist for you to be able to explain or come up with a good hypothesis. And some students actually asked a very appropriate question. They said, I think I might need to know whether growing an arm is genetic or not. In other words, are there different alleles, kind of like curly hair versus straight hair? Is that what we're looking at with saguaros? Maybe some sahuaros don't have the genes that make the signal for making arms, and so they just grow a single stem. And then other ones might have a different allele, right? They might have the same gene, developmental gene, but they have a different version of it that stimulates arm growth at some point, and at some point being very late in life. So that would be there's variation in the population. And so if there's variation in the population, if there's genetic variation in a population, then you can go on to ask the question, is there an advantage to one trait over the other in terms of reproduction and overall fitness of that particular one in that particular cacti in that environment? And so that was a completely appropriate question, and they didn't necessarily know the answer to that. And I don't necessarily know the answer to that because there is another possibility for why cacti grow arms or not. And that is they all have you could say they all have the capacity to grow arms genetically. In other words, they have the code for making arms. But maybe the environmental conditions they're living in determines whether they grow an arm or not. Right. So, for example, there might be situations where they're growing in different soil types and they have different nutrients, and you have to get to a certain nutrient load at a certain point in your life in order to be able to stimulate the turning on that particular gene to make arms. There might be other environmental conditions that then influence plants to not grow arms. So, what do I mean by that? So here's some other things that students wrote. So one thing I did in the assignment, in order to get them to do the assignment, not only was I giving credit for this assignment, like you have to write something as a group, but I also gave them extra incentive to do the best they could, because I said I would randomly draw some of their answers, right, from, I would collect them. I would then read some of their results to the rest of the class. And, so I'm reading these responses, and then I'm responding to those. And one of them was, another question came up, and that was, right, there's other phenomena that could happen. So for example, if there's plenty of water in the environment. Now in this Sonoran Desert, it's a very dry habitat, but there are some parts of the Sonoran Desert that are going to be wetter than others. If you have more water over some period of time, especially the period of time in which they may be thinking about growing arms, right, at that stage in their life history, and there's plenty of water, some students speculated that if you grow an arm, you have more water storage space, because that's what this cactus does, right? This cactus can live in an extremely dry environment, because when it rains, they have a large root network that goes not way down deep, because there really isn't any groundwater here. It fans way out, all right? So it goes way out from the plants. And then so when you get a quick thunderburst, the roots will suck up all the water from all around this particular spot, and then draw all that water up into the cacti. And if you look at these cacti, you'll see that they kind of have this folded pattern, these sort of lines down them. I mean, because that's where all the spines are. But then there's a deep crack or crevice. Well, when they suck the water up, they're kind of like an accordion. The whole thing just expands, and they can store hundreds of gallons of water inside this plant. The plant literally expands after it rains. And then it can sit there and use that water for months at a time, and then the plant just contracts over time as it uses up its water resource. All right, so now there's a potential answer, and this is one of the answers that some student groups came up with, is they suggested that having an arm gives you more water storage space. So if you have more water storage, you can survive even longer periods of time in a desert environment. So maybe some cacti grow arms because they are living in a drier environment that stimulates them to grow an arm, whereas other cacti are living in an environment where maybe there's been more water, and so they don't have that need to grow the arms because they don't need as much water storage. All right, my response to that was, that's a really great hypothesis, right? That's thinking about biology, ecology, and so forth, right? How plants live and survive. But what we need to know is, I pointed out some of the pictures I had. All right, some of my pictures here's a cactus that is 25 feet tall, and it doesn't have an arm. And right next to it is another 25-foot tall cacti, probably started out growing around the same time. And it has 15 arms. Okay, so if it were just environmental influence, they're clearly living in the same environment. They've experienced the same amount of moisture content throughout their lives. And yet one of them chose to grow a bunch of arms, and the other one decided not to grow any arms. What from that data could you surmise? You could surmise potentially that there is a genetic difference between those two plants, that one had alleles, particular genetic variations, that made it more prone not to grow arms, and the other one more prone to grow arms. So I don't know this for certain, but that suggests that it isn't just strictly an environment influence, that they don't just all have the capacity to do it, and they're just waiting for environmental cues to tell them, oh, I should grow an arm. Oh, no, I'm not going to grow an arm. I don't really need those arms. Now, what are some other reasons that students came up with for having an extra arm? Another group, some of them came up with several hypotheses, which was great, because I think it's a multivariate problem. There are probably multiple forces involved, because organisms live in active environments with lots of influences. And so you should never boil everything down to one thing, although I am going to come down to one thing probably being the most important part of this. But another group came up with this idea that if you grow an arm, you increase your photosynthetic area. How do plants grow, right? They need an energy source. And we all know that where do plants get their energy? They get it from the sun. So they're doing photosynthesis. Well, where do plants do photosynthesis? They do it in their chloroplasts, all right, a subcellular component of cells. And those chloroplasts are found on the surface cells or near the surface, just underneath the epidermal cells of a plant, but not in the internal cells of the plant because the light's not getting there. So they don't actually do photosynthesis in the internal portions of the plant tissue. So there's usually just a thin section on the surface, or even if you look at a leaf of a typical broadleaf plant, you'll see that the chloroplasts are mostly found just in the upper surface, in the cells at the upper surface of that leaf. So what about a saguaro cacti, or really any cacti? Right? They don't have leaves. They're not putting out these big broad surfaces where they can collect a lot of sunlight. All they have is stems, but their stems are green, as you can see here. That green comes from the chlorophyll, which is the molecule that is the pigment that is absorbing the energy from the sun, which will later be converted into creating sugars, the bonds in sugar molecules. All right, so a saguaro, if it's just a pole, all right, it only has X amount of surface area, total surface area. And so therefore, there is a limit to how much energy it can obtain, all right, from the sun. And so the hypothesis is if you grow an arm, you might double your photosynthetic surface area. If you double your photosynthetic surface area, you double the amount of energy you can obtain. If you have more energy, well, that actually gives you more energy to grow another arm, all right, which then gives you more energy potentially to grow another arm. And so maybe it takes many, 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 many years to get enough energy that it's worth growing an extra arm. But then once you grow that arm, you like compound the amount of energy you have, and you can continue to grow more arms. You can also send more energy into your roots to produce better root systems, which then allow you to collect more water, which now you need to fill all the space inside of those arms, which also could store more water, right? Which kind of connects it to that other hypothesis that growing an arm is a water storage unit, allowing that plant to survive longer periods of time. Now, here's the thing about photosynthesis. These are difficult hypotheses to test because this is such a long-lived organism. If you want to do a control experiment, you'd have to grow a bunch of saguaro cacti under one condition, and you have to grow a bunch of other saguaro cacti and make sure they don't have arms, like cut off the arms. And then you have to do some kind of measurement of photosynthesis and energy production from both. And even if at the end of the day, you decided that they actually produced a different amount of energy, which I wouldn't be surprised if you found a difference, you'd still have to ask yourself the question, is it consequential? Is it meaningful to the plant that it has X amount more energy? And I'm going to guess for saguaro cactus, it probably doesn't matter a whole lot. And why I say that is because these plants are in the sun half a day, every day for their entire lives. Just the amount of surface area they have is plenty of surface area to be able to help them survive, right? They're going to live with the amount of photosynthesis they're doing now. They really wouldn't necessarily know what to do with a lot more energy. They have enough energy to produce flowers. So in other words, they have enough energy to survive in that environment, and they have enough energy to reproduce. If that's what they have, increasing the total amount of energy does what? Maybe put more of that energy into storage, but storage for what if you're never going to need to use that energy? Yes, you could use some of that extra energy to grow more arms, but I haven't talked about the other trade-off here, because there were some students who pointed out there is a problem with growing arms, all right? If you grow an arm, they're very heavy, okay? These are very large plants. A standing pole, all right, is less likely to get toppled over. And so you get a large windstorm. And if you have arms, you have more surface area. More surface area, you're going to get more pressure put on the plant. And also you're not as well balanced, right? You got a large surface area. You have a large amount of mass way up high. In fact, your center of mass of the plant is actually well above the ground. And so you have to have an extremely strong base. And if you get knocked over, if there's some violent storm and you have a bunch of arms and you get knocked over, but your neighbor, which isn't growing arms, doesn't get knocked over, guess who gets to reproduce? All right. The one without the arms is going to make some flowers. Sure, it didn't make as many flowers as the neighbor would have, but the neighbor is lying on the ground and is dead. And if it's dead, it's not going to have any offspring. And therefore, the flowers from the one that don't make arms are going to then make seeds, and those seeds potentially then will influence the next generation of Sahuaros. And if there is a genetic component to making arms or not making arms, right, a propensity for one cacti to grow arms versus another, then guess what the next generation is going to look like? There's going to be more Sahuaros in the future that have no arms. But that's where we circle around and we say, I look out there and I say, you know what? Most Sahuaros that are more than 70 years old have arms. Most of them do. So I point that out to the class. Like, the vast majority do. And so apparently there must be an advantage. There must be an advantage to having arms, because you can think of disadvantages and you can think of advantages, but if you think of a disadvantage, but nonetheless the plants have them, then what can you conclude from that? You can conclude that the advantages must outweigh the disadvantages. Even if a few of them get knocked over, enough of them must survive, and they must have enough other advantages that you still end up making future generations that make arms. How can that happen? Well, the primary way that happens is, of course, reproduction. And if you make an arm, it's not hard to quantify the fact that you're going to make a lot more seeds, like a lot more seeds. And so if you grow an arm at 70 years old and you live to your 150 and you have 10 arms, you're going to make almost 10 times as many seeds. And you're doing that for every year over a 100-year period, compared to this saguaro, which can only make a certain number of flowers at the top for that same 100 years. You start adding up the number of total possible offspring of one saguaro that has 10 arms versus a saguaro with only one arm. Spread over that many years, it's a huge difference. Now, we need to talk about a little bit about the ecology of these plants too. Like when I'm out there and we're walking around, I really wanted to photograph brand new Sahuaros, all right? Just like only a year old or 2 years old. And I came away very disappointed because I couldn't find any. All right. It's like you look everywhere and you see like you're walking around, there's like these 100-year-old saguaro trees. And there's in one spot, notably in one area, and I did show a picture earlier, there was an area where there was a whole bunch of them, a whole bunch of saguaros that were all about 6 feet tall. Well, let's just say between 4 and 7 feet tall. And there weren't any older ones. And also, I just couldn't find any younger ones. So from that, what you can infer, and I think it's a very reasonable inference, and that is probably most of the saguaros are the same age or maybe within a few years, right? There was a few really good years where whatever environment was necessary for new saguaros to germinate and to grow and survive happened. And that was 50 or 60 years ago. A 6 foot tall saguaro, like my height saguaro, is usually about 60 years old. Again, it's going to depend on the conditions. If they get more water, so in some places, if you had one in your yard and you watered it all the time and it was in under better environment, they might grow quite a bit quicker, right? So maybe 30 years instead of 60 years. Nonetheless, 60 years. And then there aren't any younger saguaros. What does that tell you about the environment they're living in? It tells you that they're producing billions of seeds. All right. Billions of seeds are going out each year in the Sonoran Desert and being dropped all over the place. And yet there are probably many years, possibly dozens of years, possibly decades, possibly up to 100 years at a time, right? Where very few or none of those seeds survive, right? They're all picked up by rodents and whatever else eats them. The environmental conditions aren't right. They don't get growing. They don't survive the first year or two, which is going to be the most difficult years of their life. But if they can survive past, say, 5 years old, they now have a bunch of spines, and they can sit there and very slowly grow for the first few years because they don't have much photosynthetic region, right? And so they're just going to gradually grow until the point where they get big enough that now virtually nothing really can eat them or harm them. They become kind of impenetrable. If you live 50 years, you're probably going to live 150 years. And so they're going to spend this time growing, and they become like a generation that then survives. And then even though these plants are still trying to reproduce, they're unsuccessful for many, many years at a time. And it's just like they get the jackpot, right? There was a particular year where it's like, there was a lot of monsoons. And so it was a very wet environment. They all germinated. And so out of the billion seeds, maybe a couple 100,000 of them are going to be survivors. And that becomes the next generation. So you see, this is a really interesting life history strategy, but it also explains why. It explains the selective force here at play is it's very difficult to be successful reproducing yourself, right? It's very hard to get another cactus growing. And this is true for a lot of the other cacti in this area too. But if you can get established, it's also not difficult to live for a very long period of time. You're well protected, you're slow growing, you have all these great ways of enduring a very difficult environment, right? You're storing water, thick epidermis, you're protecting the water resource, you have these huge spines, you're not eaten by any herbivores. And so if you can make it past the first few years of your life, the lifespan can be very, very long. And so there's going to be natural selection for long life, right, for these particular plants, right? They're going to develop adaptations for stretching their lives out as long as possible. And when you put a lot of resource into a long life, what do? You don't worry as much about reproduction because it's like, if I can find a way to live for 150 years, I don't necessarily need to reproduce right away. And if you try to reproduce early on, you're going to sacrifice potentially your longer life. Now, why do I say that? Because if you try to reproduce after when you're age 4 or 5, you're going to have to devote a huge amount of energy to reproduction. These flowers are really costly. And then when you make seeds, you're going to devote a lot of energy and resources into the seeds because it's like devoting energy to your offspring, right? And so if you spend a bunch of energy when you're just a few years old trying to make some flowers so you can reproduce, you're actually putting yourself at grave risk of killing yourself, right? It's like if there were a genetic signal that said, yeah, I have to reproduce now, and you're like, well, I don't have a whole lot of energy. Well, okay, I'll sacrifice like some of my vegetative material here in order to make it into reproductive material. You're going to make yourself potentially, plants are like animals. If you're in a weakened state, parasites, other small organisms are going to start to chew on you, and you can't defend yourself because your immune system is compromised because you don't have enough energy. And so you potentially would die, right? That plant might only survive another year or two if it tried to reproduce early, in which case it only produced a few thousand seeds. And it produced them during a couple years, which were terrible years for reproduction in terms of survival of your offspring of the seeds. And then the plant dies. Well, guess what happens to the genes that gave that plant the trait to try to reproduce early? It said those genes weren't very successful, were they? They never got past to the next generation, which means what? The next generation doesn't try to reproduce early. Any variant that devotes more energy to the vegetative part of the plant and suppresses the reproductive portion of the plant and pushes it farther and later into life becomes an advantage in this particular environment, in the Sonoran Desert. Now, often in many other environments, in chaotic, disturbed environments, what happens is you can't say, I'll wait 5 years to reproduce because you might not exist in 5 years. This is true for a lot of weedy plants. So something that grows up in a field or along the side of a road, it can't go like, I think I'll spend 5 years devoting a lot of energy to making vegetative material and not trying to reproduce. And then you get mowed, and then your genes never get to be passed on to the next generation, which is why the plants that grow in those locations don't make large amounts of vegetative material. They're just interested in reproducing, and they make as many flowers as they can, as fast as they can. But they're also successful at reproducing because they live in environments where their seeds are more successful. All right, so here the seeds aren't successful. And so the strategy is you better make a lot of seeds and you better live a long time. And so natural selection has selected for traits to create these plants that have incredibly long lifespans and produce as many seeds as possible over that long lifespan. All right, so now we're getting to like what was probably the primary reason why Sahuaros grow a lot of arms is it gives them greater reproductive capacity. They're going to produce a lot more seeds, and since their chances of having an offspring, any individual Sahuaro, their chance of having a couple offspring, if they only lived 50 years, might be very, very low. But if they live 150 years, there's a good chance they might have 10 or 50 or maybe a couple thousand offspring during that time. All right, so you might want to, so that's a hypothesis. Let's call that a hypothesis. Now that's a hypothesis, and many of the students came up with this hypothesis. And the reason they did is because they know that there are many, they know reproduction is very important. And as a trait that nature selects for, reproductive capacity is one of the most important ones. So if you look at traits of organisms, you can often boil it down to how is this particular trait helping for the reproduction of this organism over time. And that's what those students did. They looked for a reproductive trait, a reproductive answer to this question of why do Sahuaros grow arms. Now, how would we test this hypothesis? Now, that's very difficult. And that's the reason why like nobody is doing like Sahuaro natural selection experiments. Because you yourself would have to have a very long lifespan in order to test this idea. You can test this on short-lived organisms, and you can test your ideas of like what is influencing the evolution of this character. But on a Sahuaro, as they're like, okay, well, I'd have to have a bunch of Sahuaros where I then mark all the seeds. I count up how many seeds they produce, how many flowers they produce for here's the ones with arms, here's the ones without arms. So I find out how many seeds they produce. Then I have to track those seeds and see how many germinate and then how many were successful in the future. And so I'd get some idea of like, yes, Sahuaros that have arms are more likely to have offspring. Therefore, their offspring are going to continue that particular trait, right? Kids are most like their parents versus like other parents that they're not related to. And so the ones with arms, if they end up with more successful offspring, are going to create more Saguaros that grow more arms over time. I didn't talk about I did talk about disadvantages. Obviously, you would say like, well, if arms are better, then why don't they grow 100 arms? And why don't they start earlier? Well, there's a trade-off. There's a trade-off in everything. So they are probably able to store more water. That's probably a good thing. Of course, if you store a lot more water and you had 100 arms, you'd have so much weight, your main stem probably couldn't hold you up, right? So there's going to be like, there's some limit there. Like, okay, if there were alleles, if there were genes that were like, let's just pop out an arm all the time, and you started producing massive numbers of arms, and then you had a big rainstorm and all those arms filled up to the max with water, then the plant tips over because it's too heavy. Guess what happens to those genes? That's what happens. It always comes back to reproduction, because if it can't reproduce because it's now lying on the ground because it made too many arms and it fell over, then it's not going to pass the genes that were influencing it to make hundreds of arms to the next generation. And so what happens is you end up selecting for plants that make arms because there's an advantage, but doesn't make too many arms, because if you make too many arms, it becomes a disadvantage, right? The same character can have positive fitness value, and it can become a negative fitness value if you overdo it. So great, produce more arms. That's all fine and dandy, but you can't go too far with it. So what is the answer? Well, in this case, we can't know for sure why Saguaro cacti grow arms, but we have some reasonable ideas, right? Some very reasonable hypotheses for this, which probably won't be tested, and so we won't be able to say with data, right? But by comparing to other models, other organisms that we have tested, we know that these are the types of factors that actually influence plants. And we can look to other plants in the environment. So for example, these are organ pipes, these things that look like Sahuaros. And this is a different genus. Genetically, if you want to think about how related they are, there's kind of like cats versus dogs in terms of the amount of genetic difference between them. So they're cacti. They're in the larger, broader cacti group, kind of like cats and dogs are carnivores in a carnivore group of mammals. And these organ pipes, they also can grow. These are actually fairly young. There are some of them, they're growing some 30 feet tall. And once again, in this particular area, there's a whole bunch of organ pipes that are all around the same age, which tells me that maybe 75 years ago, these are really slow growing as well. Maybe 75 years ago, there was a particularly good year, right? A lot of flowers. Yeah, a good year could mean a lot of flowers. Probably, though, it probably means a lot better environmental conditions for offspring to survive. And so many of them survived. And what they do is they do branch early in their life. So you can see all of them come down to the ground. So at the basal plant eventually throws off a bunch of secondary shoots very soon after the primary shoot begins to grow. So you can't even tell which is the primary stem. And then they grow these stems, but they don't grow arms later, right? So they don't grow arms, but they start out with lots of separate stems, and they grow sort of these clumps. And there can be some protective value in that too, right? It becomes much harder to attack any internal node in this particular plant. But they do the same type of thing. They're sucking up water during a rainstorm, and then they can sit there for 6 months to 9 months and not have a single drop of water. And they're fine because they have plenty of water in their stems. They do photosynthesis through their stems. All the same kind of things are probably true. And they're giving themselves more surface area as well to have flowers and produce offspring. Organ pipes are even more restricted in terms of their geographical range. They're only found in one small area there in southern Arizona and northern Mexico. All right, so Sahuaros, they're really fascinating plants. And again, like I said, iconic cacti of the desert Southwest, but live in a very limited geographical range. And it's probably limited by certain features of the Sonoran Desert in particular in terms of the amount of rainfall that they get there and the temperatures. They're very good at surviving those extreme temperatures that they have in the Sonoran Desert. And all these plants have various adaptations for surviving, the 120, 130 degree heat plus months at a time without any water. All right, that's my story about why Saguaro cacti have arms. And I'll just say one other thing about there's no dumb questions in biology. And I kind of approached my class with this. I told them the story about how I'm out there traveling during spring break and we saw these cacti, and you should be, like your biologist. And I would hope that as you see things in the world, you just ask these simple questions. It seems like a really simple question, but how long have I been droning on now? A long time. And the reason I've been droning on a long time is because it's actually kind of complicated, right? There's a lot of factors that are involved in why a cacti might grow an arm versus not growing an arm, like these don't grow arms. But once you start thinking about it, you start realizing, oh, I know something about biology. And you recognize patterns. And the reason we know about these things is because people have studied lots of different organisms in high detail and have actually studied what factors affect organisms and influence them to adapt in certain ways in certain environments. And by me teaching you the core ideas, right, the core principles of biology or the main concepts of biology, what we're hoping is that even though you've never studied a saguaro cacti or an organ pipe, and maybe you didn't even know what a saguaro was when I first started talking about it, you as a good biologist should be able to look at something like that and be able to come up with a reasonable hypothesis based on your biological knowledge to explain why they look the way that they do, right? And if you can do that, then I've accomplished my mission, right? I don't have to teach you every single fact about every organism, and here's what's been written about Sahuaros, and here's the exact research that's been done, and here's the answer. And I can't even do that for many organisms because it hasn't been done, right? But you should be able to still respond with patterns of, you should be able to come up with hypotheses that are reasonable hypotheses based on your biological knowledge. And so that's one of the ways I'm testing you, right? This is one of the reasons I do the assignments that I do in class, is rather than just saying like, here's information, you need to memorize that. I like to throw out, and we do this in my class multiple times during the semester. I just come up with it. Yeah, here's a question. Like, give me, like, take what we've learned now in this class and like provide me some written narrative that seems like a reasonable, like if you had to write a textbook and provide some kind of explanation for this particular observation, what might you write that would make sense? And if you can do that, then like I said before, I've accomplished my mission, right? I've made you into somebody who can synthesize information and apply it to new questions, right? Not simply having memorized information and facts about everything in the world and then just like, okay, I'm going to conjure up the answer to that. I mean, I've never been that way because I have a terrible memory. I don't remember facts really well. And if you've watched my videos, you know that because I do talk more in generalities because often I'll know the specific fact about something, but I've forgotten it because I can't remember it for very long. But I'm really good with concepts, all right? I really understand. I think I'm fairly good at understanding conceptually the main concepts that I need to know. And then I can look up the facts in order to fit them in order to then add more meat to the concept, right? To the hypothesis later on. So no dumb questions in a biology class because every question can be turned into something about why. Well, why is it that way? Right? You might think, well, I mean, sometimes students ask questions like, you should know this, right? So that seems like a dumb question because you should know this. But the fact is, if you ask the question, it means you don't know it, all right? Which means it's an opportunity for me to then teach you that, but also take that and turn it into something that all the students can learn from, right? So that's one of the biggest challenges of being a professor is to help everybody get something out of the types of inquiries that come to me as a faculty member. It's also one of the scary things, which is why I think a lot of faculty and a lot of professors, sometimes they love to lecture because this is like, I know stuff and I can tell you. It's really hard to deal with like, okay, now somebody just asked me something that's like not something I have memorized myself and I need to apply the information. I kind of relish that challenge to sort of like, ask me whatever you want. I have anonymous question days where it's like, okay, write your question on a little sheet of paper and I'm going to draw out 10 questions and I'm going to just try to do what I did here, which is, here's a question your kid might ask you. And can I use all the knowledge I have of biology and try to come up with what is a reasonable explanation for that, even if I've never learned that specifically myself. And by doing that, I'm trying to help students get comfortable themselves doing that, not just relying on their memory, but relying on their understanding of biology. All right. So the only dumb question, when's the exam? Because that's in the syllabus. All right. However, if you didn't know that and you didn't read the syllabus, I guess you should have asked, in which case it's not a completely dumb question because you do need to know that information. And I will tell you the answer to that question if you ask me in class. However, it does make you look like you're not prepared. And so in that way, there are negative consequences to that particular question. So that's usually what I say. There aren't any dumb questions, but there are questions that will give me the impression that you don't want to give me, because eventually I might write a letter of recommendation for you and I'm going to be like, I can't really say a lot of positive things about this person because of the types of questions they asked in class lead me to believe they don't have a very full understanding of this, and they haven't bothered to try to get a full understanding of this particular concept or this piece of information that's vital to them, like when is the exam going to be? All right, I got to quit. Can't just keep going on and on forever. I mean, if the, I guess, what am I actually doing here? It's like, I have an hour and 15 minutes lecture, and if I have 15 minutes left over, you can bet that I'll find something else to say. And that's the problem with these videos, is that I don't have like a deadline. I don't have a clock in front of me that's like, you said you're going to do it in 30 minutes, so do it in 30 minutes. It's just like I start talking and then we see where it goes. So let me say this. I'm not done talking about this particular topic. I want to talk about Sahuaros more because I want to talk about the environment they live in, the Sonoran Desert, and I want to talk about how they're ancient denizens of this place. Because another question comes up, but it's a little harder to answer, and that is, how long did this environment have to exist in order for natural selection to adapt a saguaro to this really long lifespan and not doing any reproduction for the first 35 to 70 years? How long would it take for natural selection as a process through multiple generations to sculpt the characteristics that we see in a saguaro? And so that's going to lead us to some interesting questions about the age of the desert itself. And we'll kind of explore this with respect to my other interest, which is the question of the age of the earth and creationism and so forth. But I didn't want to get into that in this particular talk. We'll kind of talk about the meaning of Saguaro cacti in the perspective of young earth creationist ideas about speciation and evolution and change and so forth. We'll do that in another video. Till then, thanks for hanging out with me. We'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.